The grand ballroom of the Columbus Convention Center hummed with the sophisticated clinking of crystal champagne flutes, the quiet rustle of silk evening gowns, and a soft background jazz quartet that seemed entirely oblivious to the silent ache swelling inside my chest. I sat near the head of the primary honored table, wearing a tailored navy wool blazer that buttoned sharply at my waist, carefully structured to conceal the thick, faded surgical scars running down my lumbar spine. Those scars were the permanent physical markers of a catastrophic bridge framework collapse 5 years ago that had abruptly ended my 15-year career as a senior structural engineer, forcing me into early retirement at 31 and leaving me with a dull, perpetual throbbing in my lower back. Tonight was intended to be the grand culmination of my 15 years of quietly advising, calculating stress thresholds, and overseeing safety protocols for Franklin Industrial Systems, an honor the executive board had insistently organized to commemorate my contributions to the city's infrastructure. Yet, as the soft, golden spotlights beamed down toward the stage, my eyes remained hopelessly fixed on the single, unoccupied velvet armchair directly across from me. A polished brass card holder rested on the white linen table runner, displaying a heavy stock name card that read, Julian Bennett. Less than 45 minutes ago, while sitting in the green room, applying lipstick with trembling fingers, my 38-year-old stepson had sent a brief, brutally offhand text message. Swamped with quarterly audit reviews and Ashley's dinner reservations at the club tonight, Evie. Just take an Uber home after your speech. I stared at the glowing smartphone screen in the dim ballroom light, swallowing the familiar, bitter lump in my throat. For 15 years, ever since I married Thomas when I was 21 and stepped into the quiet, complex role of a young stepmother to his 2 teenage children, I had poured every ounce of my energy into building bridges, both literal structures of steel and concrete, and fragile emotional pathways between myself and my husband's children. Standing in the soft spotlight as the master of ceremonies cleared her throat at the podium, I realized with a crushing, suffocating certainty that no matter how many tons of steel I had calculated to span roaring rivers, I had never managed to build a bridge that could reach my stepson's heart. Noticing my prolonged, motionless silence as I stared across the table at the velvet chair, the corporate event coordinator, a young woman holding a clipboard and wearing an earpiece, stepped quietly out from behind the velvet podium curtain. She knelt beside my chair, her face softened by gentle, professional concern. "Mrs. Bennett," she whispered softly, eyeing the vacant seat with an awkward grimace. "The CEO is scheduled to begin the opening address in 3 minutes, but we noticed your family hasn't filled their reserved section yet. Should we hold the opening presentation for another 10 or 15 minutes to allow your stepson's car time to clear the downtown traffic?" I slowly pulled my gaze away from the brass name card, offering her a calm, practiced smile that masked the deep, familiar exhaustion settling behind my eyes. "No, thank you," I replied, my voice remarkably steady. "Please proceed strictly on schedule. My stepson will not be joining us tonight." The coordinator nodded sympathetically, her eyes sweeping across the sprawling sea of 400 dressed-up executives, municipal engineers, corporate sponsors, and local news camera operators. "Understood, ma'am. Would you prefer our staging crew to quietly remove the name card and shift the chair so you don't have to sit directly beside an unoccupied seat during the live broadcast?" I hesitated, letting my eyes wander past the primary VIP tables, past the floral arrangements and polished ice sculptures, toward the very back row of the auditorium, near the soundboard enclosure. Standing quietly against the concrete pillar, dressed in a neatly ironed but noticeably faded navy suit, was 29-year-old Daniel Brooks. He was holding a small handheld camera, looking entirely out of place amidst the glitz and corporate opulence of the ballroom. Daniel was the son of Marcus Brooks, the heroic site foreman who had thrown his own body over mine when the bridge framework caved in a decade ago, taking the brunt of 3 tons of falling steel and sacrificing his physical mobility to ensure I survived. Since Marcus's passing 3 years ago, Daniel had worked tirelessly as a public high school robotics teacher, spending his meager evenings and weekends repairing discarded technical equipment for underprivileged teenagers. I turned back to the coordinator, a sudden, warm clarity washing over me. "Leave the chair exactly where it is," I said softly. "But please go to the back row and bring Daniel Brooks down to sit beside me." The usher hurried down the long, carpeted side aisle, approached the bewildered young man, and whispered something into his ear while gesturing toward the front stage. Daniel's eyes widened in sudden panic as he looked across the vast ballroom, clearly embarrassed by the sudden attention as several corporate guests turned in their plush seats to watch his approach. Walking with a slight, hesitant stoop, he adjusted his tie nervously as the usher guided him straight to the VIP table. When he reached the front row, I pushed back my chair, stood up with a warm, welcoming smile, and pulled out the heavy velvet armchair for him myself. "Sit down with me, Daniel," I said softly, placing my bandaged hand gently over his sleeve to steady his trembling frame. Daniel looked down at the polished brass card holder bearing Julian's printed name, his voice thick with quiet, stammering disbelief. "Mrs. Bennett, please, I can't sit here. This is your family's private table, right in front of the press cameras. I'm just here to take a few photos for the school newsletter. I don't belong at the head table with the company board members." I looked straight into his honest, hard-working brown eyes that carried the exact same unselfish warmth his father had possessed when he worked alongside me on dusty construction sites. "Your father gave his health so that I could walk out of that collapsed bridge alive, Daniel," I whispered, squeezing his shoulder through his suit jacket. "And when Thomas passed away 4 months ago, while my own children were too consumed by their social schedules to check on me, you were the only person who drove to my house on Sunday mornings to clear fallen oak branches off my roof and fix my leaking cellar door without asking for a single dollar. You belong at this table far more than anyone who chose to be somewhere else tonight." As Daniel swallowed hard, wiped a stray tear from his eye, and took his seat, the ballroom lights dimmed completely, and the towering digital screens behind the main stage flared to life with the official corporate livestream logo. The chief executive officer of Franklin Industrial Systems, Arthur Vance, a silver-haired man in a bespoke tuxedo, stepped up to the crystal podium, his authoritative voice echoing through the surround sound speakers. For 15 minutes, Arthur delivered a glowing retrospective of my engineering milestones, displaying high-definition blueprints of municipal bridges, transit hubs, and industrial facilities I had recalibrated over the past decade and a half. But as the presentation reached its climax, Arthur paused, adjusting his reading glasses, and turned his gaze directly toward our table. "Ladies and gentlemen," Arthur announced, his tone shifting from formal corporate reporting to deep, emotional reverence. "Evelyn Bennett's lasting legacy to this company and this city is defined not merely by the thousands of tons of steel girders she calculated, but by her extraordinary, silent selflessness. Over the past 12 years, Evelyn consistently declined her annual executive performance bonuses, stock option allocations, and discretionary consulting fees. Instead, she quietly directed our legal team to channel those funds into a specialized, tax-exempt educational endowment, the Evelyn Bennett STEM and Mentorship Foundation." A collective gasp of astonishment rippled across the 400 attendees, followed by eager whispers from the press section. Arthur raised his hand, continuing over the low hum of the crowd. Today, through careful investment and corporate matching, that endowment has matured to an incredible $800,000. According to our corporate charter, Evelyn retains the sole, absolute legal right to appoint the Foundation's permanent executive director, a lifetime position that carries total operational authority over the entire $800,000 grant allocation. Arthur turned toward the podium microphone, his face beaming with pride as he gestured toward the front row. Tonight, Mrs. Bennett has officially designated her inaugural director. Please join me in congratulating the new executive director of the STEM Foundation, Mr. Daniel Brooks. The entire convention center erupted into a deafening, thunderous standing ovation. High-powered executives, city council members, veteran engineers, and journalists rose to their feet, their applause filling the cavernous space. Daniel completely froze in his armchair, the color draining entirely from his face as he stared at the glowing stage in absolute paralyzing shock. Mrs. Bennett? No. Oh, God, this can't be real, he stammered, tears instantly welling over his eyelashes and dripping onto his lapels. I leaned over, taking his shaking, calloused hands into my own scarred fingers, giving them a firm, reassuring squeeze. It is real, Daniel, I said softly, my voice carrying a quiet, triumphant warmth. You are going to build robotics labs and engineering workshops for every underfunded public school in this city, and no child will ever be turned away from their dreams because they can't afford a circuit board. An hour later, after the applause had faded and the ballroom had emptied, I sat alone inside the quiet cab of my 12-year-old Ford pickup truck in the dark convention center parking garage. Beside me on the bench seat, my smartphone was vibrating incessantly, its screen lighting up the dark interior with a relentless barrage of notifications. 112 missed calls, and dozens of panicked, furious text messages from Julian and his wife Ashley. The live stream clip of me inviting Daniel to Julian's vacant chair had already gone viral across LinkedIn and TikTok, and the unstoppable storm of public consequences was about to strike my family with overwhelming force. The neon glow of the dashboard clock read 10:45 p.m. by the time I guided my old Ford pickup truck out of the convention center garage and merged onto the wet, glistening asphalt of Interstate 70. On the bench seat beside me, my smartphone continued to buzz every few seconds, like an angry hornet, its illuminated screen displaying an unbroken wall of notifications. There were 34 missed calls from Julian, 22 from his wife Ashley, and dozens of urgent text messages from extended family members and former colleagues who had watched the corporate livestream. I did not pick up the phone. I drove with both hands firmly at 10 and 2 on the worn leather steering wheel, my bandaged wrists aching slightly under the strain, listening to the steady, rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers against the glass. I was not ignoring my stepson out of petty malice or a desire to punish him. I simply understood that reacting in the immediate heat of public scandal would only breed more noise. 6 years ago, when Thomas was still alive and battling his initial cancer diagnosis, Julian had met Ashley at a high-end tech mixer in downtown Columbus. Almost overnight, the warm, grounded young man who used to help his father restore old outboard motors was replaced by someone obsessed with country club memberships, luxury European SUVs, and the superficial validation of social status. Ashley had made it clear from their very first Thanksgiving dinner that she regarded me as an awkward, blue-collar intrusion into the Bennett family, a woman who spent her weekends in grease-stained overalls fixing foundation beams, rather than attending charity galas. While I navigated the rain-slicked highway toward Westerville, the viral wave generated by the livestream was already tearing through Julian and Ashley's quiet, luxurious world at a 5-star resort in Scottsdale, Arizona. They had flown south for a long weekend getaway, deliberately choosing the trip over my recognition ceremony after Ashley found a discounted package deal online. Julian was sitting by the resort's illuminated infinity pool, sipping a scotch and reviewing quarterly software projections on his tablet when his phone began blowing up with messages from his senior partners. The first text came from his company's vice president of human resources, containing a direct link to a TikTok video that had already racked up 3.5 million views in under 3 hours. The video, clipped directly from Franklin Industrial's official LinkedIn stream, showed the high-definition moment when the CEO pointed to the front row, highlighting the empty velvet armchair with Julian's name card clearly visible in the frame. The camera then captured my quiet, dignified voice, inviting 29-year-old Daniel Brooks, a young man in a worn navy suit, to step forward and take the family seat, before announcing the creation of the $800,000 STEM Foundation. The top comment on the video, liked by over 80,000 people, read, "Imagine skipping your own mother's lifetime honor for a weekend tan, only to watch her hand an $800,000 legacy to the guy who actually showed up." The public embarrassment hit Ashley like a physical shock, but her panic instantly morphed into sharp, defensive anger. Standing on the balcony of their hotel suite overlooking the desert palms, she paced back and forth, her voice rising in frantic agitation as Julian sat frozen on the edge of the bed, his face drained of all color. "She did this on purpose, Julian," Ashley hissed, clutching her phone as more notifications poured in from her social circles in Columbus. "Your stepmother planned this whole public spectacle just to humiliate us. She knew the event was being broadcast live to the entire engineering sector. How are we supposed to show our faces at the country club gala next month when everyone thinks we abandoned her for a resort trip?" Julian didn't answer right away. He was staring at the screenshot a colleague had sent him, a clear, high-resolution freeze frame of the empty chair bearing his name sitting right beside my small, bandaged hands resting on the tablecloth. For the first time in 6 years, the polished, superficial armor Julian had constructed around his life began to crack. He remembered the text message he had sent me just 24 hours earlier. "Swamped with work and Ashley's dinner plans tonight, Evie. Just take an Uber home after your speech." He remembered how casually he had dismissed my invitation, convincing himself that a corporate dinner was just another boring industry event that didn't require his presence. Deep beneath Ashley's outrage over social status lay a far more bitter realization that drove her into a frenzy: the absolute loss of financial control over an $800,000 fortune she had privately assumed belonged to the Bennett family estate. For years, Ashley had operated under the comfortable assumption that my quiet, frugal lifestyle meant I was sitting on a massive personal nest egg that would eventually pass directly to Julian and his sister Chloe upon my death. Seeing $800,000 placed into an irrevocable, non-profit corporate trust managed entirely by Daniel Brooks felt to her like a direct theft of her children's inheritance. "She can't just give away $800,000 to some random teacher's kid," Ashley shouted, slamming her hand against the glass patio door. "That money was built during her marriage to your father. It's family capital, Julian. We need to call in a state lawyer first thing tomorrow morning and contest the transfer. We can argue she's mentally unstable from her spinal injury, or that she was unduly influenced by this Brooks kid." Julian looked up at his wife, his eyes hollow and filled with a sudden, sickening clarity. "Ashley, stop," he whispered, his voice raspy and shaking. "It wasn't Dad's money. It was her own performance bonuses that she turned down for 12 years. She built that fund with her own hands while we were busy ignoring her." Back in Westerville, I pulled my pickup truck into the gravel driveway of my quiet 2-story Craftsman home shortly after 11 o'clock. The rain had slowed to a soft, misty drizzle that blanketed the dark garden in stillness. As I stepped onto the front porch, my phone vibrated one last time in my jacket pocket. It was the 113th call of the night. I pulled the device out, looked at the screen displaying Julian's name, and finally pressed the green button to answer. "Evie!" Julian's voice burst through the speaker, frantic, breathless, and choked with a mixture of shame and desperation. "Evie, please tell me you're okay."
"We saw the news clip. Ashley and I are at the airport in Phoenix right now. We booked the first flight back to Columbus. Why didn't you tell us about the $800,000 fund? Why did you put Daniel in my seat on national television? Do you have any idea what people are saying about us online?" I stood under the warm yellow porch light, key in hand, listening to his panic with a calm, unyielding serenity. "Julian," I said quietly, my voice steady against the soft sound of the night rain.
"I didn't humiliate you on national television. I simply left your chair where you placed it, empty. Daniel was there because he chose to show up. You are on a plane right now, not because you miss your mother, but because your public image is burning. When you land in Columbus tomorrow morning, don't come to my house looking for an apology. Come only if you are ready to look at the truth." Before he could respond, I ended the call, walked inside, and locked the door behind me. At 10 o'clock the following evening, the glare of bright headlights pierced through the thick, blanketed mist outside my Westerville home as Julian's black SUV pulled violently onto the gravel driveway. I was sitting quietly in my oversized rocking chair beside the brick fireplace, wearing a cozy gray knit cardigan over a plain cotton shirt, a warm porcelain mug of chamomile tea resting on the small end table beside me. The heavy oak front door rattled twice before swinging open with a sharp creak, and Ashley stormed into the living room like a whirlwind of unrestrained fury, her designer leather trench coat slick with autumn rain. Julian followed several paces behind her, his gait heavy, his posture slouched, and his eyes hollowed out by dark purple circles from a night spent awake on a flight from Phoenix. Ashley didn't even bother unbuttoning her coat or taking off her wet boots. She marched straight to the center of the hand-woven rug, her polished, manicured nails digging deeply into the leather strap of her handbag as she glared at me. "We're completely done playing gentle family games with you, Evelyn," Ashley declared, her voice trembling violently with an explosive mixture of rage and wounded elite pride. "We spent the entire flight reading dozens of online articles mocking Julian's character. You intentionally staged that whole publicity stunt at the convention center to make Julian look like an ungrateful monster so you could hand $800,000 to your little pet teacher." I didn't rise from my rocking chair, nor did I raise my voice to match her high-pitched, echoing aggression. I simply took a slow, deliberate sip of my tea, set the porcelain cup back down onto its saucer with a soft clink, and looked directly into Ashley's frantic, bloodshot eyes. "Ashley, this is my home," I said, with a quiet, unshakable authority that froze the air in the room. "If you came here to scream at me about public opinions you created entirely with your own choices, you can turn around and step back out into the rain." Ashley's face flushed a deep, mottled crimson as she stepped even closer, slamming a thick manila folder of printed legal documents directly onto my coffee table. "We spoke to a senior probate attorney in downtown Columbus at 8 this morning," she snapped, tapping her long index finger against the paper stack with sharp, rhythmic thuds. "Thomas was my husband's father, and Julian is his sole biological male heir. That $800,000 endowment was accumulated during your marriage to Thomas, which legally makes it marital assets." We are demanding an immediate court injunction to freeze the fund transfer to Daniel Brooks, or we will file a formal lawsuit contesting your mental capacity following your spinal injury and claiming undue financial influence. I looked past Ashley's shaking finger, focusing entirely on Julian, who was standing frozen by the entryway console, his face pale as chalk as he stared blankly at the dark hardwood floorboards. "Is this what you truly want, Julian?" I asked softly, my voice cutting through the tension. "Are you really bringing lawyers into your father's home to seize a non-profit STEM grant meant for poor children?" Julian opened his dry lips to speak, but Ashley instantly cut in with venomous speed. "Don't try to emotionally manipulate him, Evelyn. Julian deserves what rightfully belongs to the Bennett family line." Without saying another word, I leaned forward in my chair, opened the lower wooden doors of the side table, and pulled out 3 heavy, dust-covered tin document boxes. I placed them one by one onto the wooden coffee table, pushing Ashley's legal papers aside with a dull, scraping metal noise. The rusted metal boxes bore faded, handwritten labels written in blue marker across their lids. "Before you call another probate attorney, Julian," I said, looking at my stepson with a calm, penetrating gaze, "I suggest you walk over here, kneel down, and open box number 1. Julian hesitated, his eyes darting back and forth between my steady face and the rusted brass latch on the first tin box. Slowly, as if pulled by an irresistible gravitational weight, he stepped past his wife and knelt on the rug. He unlatched the brass clip with trembling fingers and lifted the lid. Inside were not stock certificates or corporate deeds, but a thick, yellowed stack of canceled personal checks, bank wire receipts, and legal promissory notes dating back 8 years. Julian picked up the top wire receipt, his thumb tracing my signature on a check made out for $45,000. Beneath it was a formal confirmation letter from a Bellevue mortgage lender. "That check covered the required down payment on your very first townhouse, Julian," I said gently. "You told all your tech friends you bought it with your software bonus, but your bonus fell $30,000 short. Your father and I quietly sold our prized fishing boat and emptied my personal disability retirement reserve to wire that money so you wouldn't lose the purchase." Julian's hands began to shake violently as he dropped the bank receipt back into the tin and pulled out a second plastic folder from box number 1. It contained itemized legal fee statements from Chloe's brutal divorce 3 years ago, over $32,000 paid in full to a family law firm in Columbus, accompanied by nighttime shift schedules showing I had taken on extra structural consulting contracts after my spine injury just to pay those legal invoices without taking a single dime from Thomas's cancer treatment fund. Ashley leaned over her husband's shoulder, her eyes widening in sudden, stunned confusion as she scanned the indisputable paper trail of selflessness. "I then suggest you open box number 2, Julian," I continued quietly, my tone echoing with gentle solemnity. Julian unlatched the second tin box. Inside were dozens of handwritten journal entries, personal letters, and hospital notes written by Thomas during his final months of life. Julian picked up a single sheet of stationery dated just 6 months before Thomas passed away, reading his father's neat, familiar cursive handwriting aloud in a breaking, raspy whisper. Evie sat up with me until 3 a.m. again while the chemotherapy pains tore through my stomach. She hasn't mentioned her own back pain once in 3 years. Julian thinks Evie married me for financial security, but the absolute truth is, Evie quietly paid off our family home's secondary mortgage using her own insurance settlement, so Julian and Chloe would inherit an unencumbered estate. If my son ever measures Evie's worth by her silence, I hope God opens his eyes before he loses the only mother who ever truly fought for him. Julian dropped the letter onto the rug and covered his face with both hands, a low, agonizing sob erupting from deep within his chest. The artificial arrogance and corporate pride he had carried for 6 years dissolved entirely, leaving him kneeling on the floor like a heartbroken child facing the ruins of his own superficiality. Ashley stood frozen above him, her mouth slightly open, her handbag slipping from her shoulder as her legal folder fluttered uselessly onto the carpet. The 3 tin boxes sat open between them, a silent, undeniable testament to 15 years of unheralded, unconditional sacrifice. "And box number 3, I said softly, resting my scarred palm over the final tin, contains the legal charter for the STEM Foundation. It is an irrevocable 501c3 nonprofit trust, registered under state corporate law. It contains $0 of your father's estate, $0 of personal wealth, and $0 that any probate court in this country will ever award to you. It belongs entirely to children who need a chance in life." I looked up at Ashley, whose face was now pale, hollow, and completely drained of her earlier bravado. "You brought high-priced lawyers to my home to demand what you thought was yours," I concluded quietly. "Now you finally see what was actually given to you."
You may leave my house now, Ashley. But Julian, if you want to stay and finally talk to your mother, there is a warm cup of tea waiting for you. A soft, tentative knock at the front door shattered the heavy, tear-filled silence lingering in the living room. Before anyone could move, the heavy oak door creaked open, and 29-year-old Daniel Brooks stepped quietly into the entryway, carrying a large, steaming ceramic pot wrapped in a clean, white kitchen towel. His boots were damp from the rain outside, and his face showed a mixture of polite hesitation and genuine concern as he looked at the open tin boxes scattered across the rug. "Mrs. Bennett, I saw the SUV parked in the driveway and thought you might all be exhausted after such a long, emotional day, so I made some homemade chicken vegetable soup," Daniel said softly, his voice calm and respectful as he stepped past the entryway. Without needing to ask for directions, Daniel walked straight toward the kitchen, reached naturally into the upper glass cabinet, retrieved 4 porcelain bowls and matching soup spoons, and placed them neatly on the dark oak dining table. Julian, still kneeling on the carpet with his father's letters in his hands, watched Daniel's effortless familiarity with my home in quiet, devastating shock. It hit my stepson like a physical blow. While he had spent the last 6 years treating his childhood home as an inconvenient pit stop between luxury golf trips and corporate mixers, Daniel, the son of a late site foreman, had been quietly showing up on rainy evenings, repairing broken window frames and knowing exactly where the soup bowls were kept. Watching Daniel set the dining table with such quiet, natural grace was the final breaking point for Ashley. Her fragile ego, already shattered by the legal reality of the nonprofit trust, exploded into pure, unvarnished malice. She snatched her designer handbag off the floor, her face twisting into a bitter mask as she pointed a trembling, manicured finger at Daniel, and then at me. "Is this the pathetic little circus you put together for us, Evelyn?" Ashley hissed, her voice sharp enough to slice through the quiet room. "You bring this charity case into your home to play the loyal, dutiful son while you make my husband look like a public disgrace in front of the entire country? You staged this whole pathetic scene with your little metal boxes just to turn Julian against me." Julian stood up slowly from the floor. His posture was no longer slouched or defeated. His expression had turned cold, rigid, and illuminated by a terrifying, absolute clarity. He stepped directly between Ashley and my rocking chair, looking at his wife not with anger or hostility, but with the hollow detachment of a man who was seeing the person he married clearly for the very first time in 6 years. "Ashley,
Take your handbag, get in the SUV, and go back to the hotel, Julian said, his voice terrifyingly quiet. Ashley blinked in total stunned disbelief. What did you just say to me, Julian? I said leave, Julian repeated, his eyes unblinking. You came into my mother's home to threaten her with probate lawyers over money she earned with her own body while taking care of my dying father? Take the SUV and leave. I am staying here with my mother. When the heavy oak front door slammed shut behind Ashley and the angry roar of her SUV engine faded down the rain-slicked gravel driveway, an extraordinary, weightless stillness settled over the house. The poisonous tension that had choked the living room evaporated into the autumn air, replaced by the rich, comforting aroma of roasted chicken, rosemary, and simmered vegetables. Daniel quietly ladled the hot soup into the porcelain bowls set upon the dark oak dining table. I sat at the head of the table, with Julian sitting on my left and Daniel on my right. For the first 20 minutes, no one spoke a single word about lawsuits, viral videos, estate lawyers, or corporate grant money. We simply ate together in quiet sanctuary, the soft clink of spoons against porcelain blending with the steady, rhythmic patter of rain tapping against the glass window panes. It was the simplest, most unpretentious meal Julian had eaten in over 6 years. No high-end country club etiquette, no pretentious wine pairings, no business networking, and no artificial status chatter. As Julian took his final bite, he looked slowly around the warm dining room, noticing for the first time the fresh weather stripping Daniel had installed around the drafty back door, and the hand-carved cedar coaster resting beneath his water glass, a coaster his father had carved in his basement workshop shortly before he died. Julian set his spoon down on the woven placemat, his eyes glistening with fresh tears under the soft chandelier light, as he looked directly across the table at me. I spent 6 years confusing your patience for permission, Evie, he confessed, his voice breaking softly into the quiet room. I told myself that because you were quiet, because you never complained or demanded attention when we canceled Thanksgiving dinners or sent a text telling you to take an Uber, that you simply didn't mind. I let Ashley convince me that status and wealth were the only things that defined a successful life, and I treated the woman who gave up her own retirement reserve for my townhouse like an awkward afterthought. I reached across the table, laying my bandaged hand gently over his trembling, calloused knuckles. Forgiveness is easy to give, Julian, I said softly, offering him a faint, compassionate smile that carried 15 years of unspoken love. Your father and I never held a grudge against you, but trust is a bridge that has to be rebuilt one wooden plank at a time. You don't build it with grand public apologies or tearful promises. You build it simply by showing up when the rain starts. Julian squeezed my fingers tightly, his head bowed as silent tears traced down his cheeks onto the dark wood table. 3 weeks after that quiet midnight supper, Julian made the hardest, most painful, and ultimately most courageous decision of his adult life. He realized that his marriage to Ashley had been constructed entirely on a hollow foundation of shared vanity, superficial ambition, and competitive social status. A lifestyle that had systematically hollowed out his integrity, corrupted his character, and separated him from the grounded values his father had worked 30 years to instill in him. After several quiet, agonizing conversations, they officially separated and filed for an amicable divorce. Julian walked away from the exclusive country club memberships, the high-status social galas, and the toxic social circles that had once consumed his entire identity. He leased a modest, sunlit 2-bedroom apartment just 3 miles down the road from my Westerville home, taking a deliberate step back from his corporate rat race to recalibrate his soul. He didn't do it out of despair, anger, or public defeat, but out of an honest, desperate desire to shed the artificial noise of his past, ready to start rebuilding a real, grounded life, one Wednesday morning coffee and one quiet family supper at a time. In the months following his official separation from Ashley, Julian quickly discovered that true personal redemption was not something achieved through dramatic gestures or grand emotional speeches, but through the quiet, unglamorous discipline of showing up every single week. Without making any grand announcements or seeking verbal praise, he restructured his demanding corporate calendar, canceling his non-essential early morning strategy calls every Wednesday. At 7:30 sharp each Wednesday morning, the familiar rumble of his SUV would echo down my gravel driveway in Westerville. Stepfather's legacy or not, he walked up the front steps carrying 2 large paper cups of hot hazelnut coffee from the local bakery downtown, the exact roast his father had loved. We sat together on the front porch in the crisp morning air, wrapped in warm wool blankets, watching the golden autumn leaves drift lazily across the lawn, while talking about simple, grounding realities. His new independent software consulting projects, my ongoing physical therapy exercises for my spine, and my 10-year-old step-grandson Ethan's weekend soccer matches. When I gently reminded him during his 4th consecutive visit that he didn't need to drive 20 minutes across town just to bring me a coffee, Julian looked at me with a soft, earnest smile and said, "When I was younger, Evie, you sold your own security to build a floor under my feet. Driving 20 minutes to sit on this porch and hear your voice is the easiest, most important choice I make all week." On a bright, cool Saturday morning in mid-November, as the morning frost glistened on the grass, Julian walked into my garage and brought out 2 weathered fiberglass fishing rods, the very rods his father, Thomas, had taught him to cast with when he was just 8 years old. We drove together to Alum Creek Lake, parking near the weathered wooden dock where Thomas used to bring the family every summer before his illness. Sitting side by side on the damp wooden planks as the pale morning sun reflected off the calm, glassy surface of the water, Julian cast his fishing line out into the deep blue lake. The heavy silence between us was no longer cold, awkward, or strained. It was filled with the peaceful, unspoken warmth of 2 people who had finally stopped running from their past and learned to sit together in the present. "Dad loved this exact spot," Julian whispered softly, his eyes fixed on the bright orange bobber floating gently on the water. He used to tell me that fishing teaches a man how to wait for what actually matters instead of frantically chasing every temporary ripple on the surface. I spent 6 long years chasing ripples, Evie. I'm just so glad I finally stopped before the lake froze over completely. While our family was quietly repairing its emotional foundation, the $800,000 STEM Foundation was blooming into an extraordinary, transformative force across the public school district under Daniel Brooks's visionary leadership. Daniel didn't spend a single dollar of the grant money on flashy corporate galas, high-end administrative offices, or executive salaries. Instead, he leased an abandoned municipal warehouse near the city center and converted it into a state-of-the-art youth robotics laboratory. He purchased microcontrollers, 3D printers, soldering stations, and advanced computing rigs, establishing free after-school engineering workshops for hundreds of low-income middle and high school students who had never owned a personal computer. Local news stations aired inspiring feature stories highlighting the warehouse, showing high-definition footage of Daniel patiently guiding teenagers through complex programming lines and structural balance tests.
Whenever reporters praised him as a local hero, Daniel gently directed their microphones toward the polished brass plaque mounted beside the laboratory entrance, a plaque dedicated to Marcus Brooks and Thomas Bennett, honoring two working-class fathers whose legacy of quiet sacrifice had made the entire facility possible. The quiet, healing shift taking place within our family echoed most beautifully through my 10-year-old step-grandson, Ethan. On a crisp afternoon in late November, Ethan wandered into my garage while I was recalibrating a set of spirit levels on my woodworking bench. He ran his small fingers along the smooth, fragrant grain of a pine cabinet, his bright blue eyes filled with genuine curiosity. "Dad says you used to be a senior structural engineer, Grandma Evie," Ethan said, looking up at me with open wonder. "He told me you know how to build real bridges that hold up thousands of cars." I smiled warmly, setting down my tools and pulling up a wooden stool for him to sit on. "Engineering is just the art of making sure heavy things don't fall down when the wind blows, Ethan." For the next 3 hours, Ethan and I worked side by side at the bench, measuring cedar planks, sanding rough edges with sandpaper, and carefully driving small brass nails to construct a simple toy wooden car. When we finished, the car's rear axle was slightly crooked, making it veer gently to the left whenever we pushed it across the wooden workbench. "It's not perfect, Grandma Evie," Ethan said, a tiny frown appearing on his forehead. I placed my bandaged hand gently over his small shoulder and smiled. "Neither are families, Ethan. But as long as the wood is sound and the glue is strong, it will roll through any storm." Sitting on my back porch late that evening, watching the silver moonlight filter through the bare, dark branches of the oak trees, a profound sense of quiet liberation settled over my heart. I looked through the kitchen window at the small brass lamp burning softly in the living room, illuminating the scene where Julian and Daniel were sitting together across a wooden chessboard, laughing over an old memory of Thomas. The painful, haunting shadow of the empty velvet chair at the convention center had vanished completely, not because the public media had forgotten about the viral video, but because my home had finally become a genuine sanctuary where real presence was valued far above superficial prestige. My silent sacrifices over 15 years had never made me a victim, just as Julian's past mistakes had not made him irredeemable. Standing under the vast, starlit Ohio sky, I felt Thomas's enduring love surrounding us like a warm cloak, knowing with absolute certainty that our family was finally built on a foundation that nothing in this world could ever break again. Exactly 1 year after the stormy night at the convention center, Franklin Industrial Systems hosted the official inauguration ceremony for the expanded Enterprise Mentorship and STEM Initiative. The grand ballroom at the Columbus Convention Center was once again filled with hundreds of community leaders, public school educators, corporate sponsors, and dozens of young, excited students from Daniel's youth robotics program. As I walked into the auditorium wearing a simple, elegant emerald green dress, the vast room was buzzing with a completely different kind of energy. Not the cold, superficial corporate posturing of the past, but a genuine sense of shared purpose, humility, and deep mutual respect. When the event organizers guided me toward the front VIP table near the stage, I paused at the head of the table. The plush armchairs were arranged neatly around the podium, and this time there was no anxiety in my chest, no bitter lump in my throat, and no heavy dread of staring at a vacant, cold velvet seat. The front row today was completely filled, carrying no empty chairs whatsoever. Julian had arrived almost an hour early, wearing a simple but sharply tailored gray suit, sitting attentively beside his sister Chloe and his 10-year-old son, Ethan. Sitting beside them was Daniel Brooks, smiling proudly as he adjusted the collars of several star students from his robotics lab who had been invited to receive regional engineering scholarships. As I approached our table, Julian immediately stood up,
his eyes shining with warmth as he gently pulled out my chair with profound, heartfelt respect and tenderness. No one at our table was checking a smartphone. No one was glancing at a watch or discussing busy corporate schedule conflicts elsewhere. All of my children's eyes were turned toward me with unconditional love and complete, unwavering presence. A priceless, sacred gift that no amount of corporate wealth or superficial social status could ever purchase. During the formal recognition portion of the evening, Julian stepped up to the crystal microphone on behalf of the founding partner families. Standing before hundreds of distinguished corporate guests, city officials, and local news camera crews, he made no attempt to hide his past or make polished excuses for his previous mistakes. Julian looked directly down at me, his voice trembling with deep emotion, yet filled with quiet, unshakable courage. 1 year ago, I left an empty chair right here at this table because I was hopelessly chasing superficial status and corporate validation. I used to foolishly believe that providing material security was a son's only true duty. But my mother, a woman who quietly sacrificed her youth, her financial security, and her physical health for our family, taught me that the greatest success a child can ever achieve is simply being present when those they love need them most. From this day forward, the chair beside my mother will never stand empty again. The entire auditorium erupted into a thunderous standing ovation, and tears glistened brightly in the eyes of both my adult children. After the ceremony concluded and the evening applause faded, we returned together to our warm, familiar craftsman home in Westerville. While the children and grandchildren were happily clearing the dinner plates in the kitchen and decorating a celebratory chocolate cake, I opened the small clutter drawer beside the refrigerator to search for a pair of craft scissors. My fingers brushed against a heavy, gold-embossed invitation to an exclusive corporate country club gala that had arrived in the mail the previous week. I pulled the envelope out, looked at the glittering gold lettering beneath the warm overhead kitchen light, and felt a quiet, extraordinarily peaceful smile touch my lips. My happiness had never depended on public acclaim, corporate titles, or social validation. True fulfillment was standing right here in my own home, listening to Julian and Chloe laughing together in the adjoining room, smelling the warm soup on the stove, and feeling the genuine, unbreakable bond of a family that had survived the storm. Without a single moment's hesitation or emotional weight, I dropped the invitation straight into the recycling bin and closed the door firmly behind it. I stepped out onto the quiet back porch, taking a deep, peaceful breath of the cool, crisp autumn night air. Looking up at the vast, starlit sky above Columbus, I felt the gentle, enduring presence of Thomas and Marcus, smiling down on us from the quiet beyond. Turning 36 amidst profound loss, physical pain, and public trials was no longer a heavy burden to bear. It had become the solid, unshakable foundation for a beautiful, free chapter of my life. Presence is the most valuable gift we can ever offer the people we love. Time is the one resource that money can never buy back. Holding Julian's and Chloe's hands tightly as they stepped out onto the porch to stand closely beside me, I smiled brightly into the night air, knowing that our family's legacy of love, honesty, and quiet sacrifice was finally completely free.